morning and welcome to Workflow Wednesday. Well, here we've got a file that was shot in RAW, and as you can see it is a little bit underexposed, and yes, I do occasionally make a mistake myself, and on this occasion it's an image that I do need to produce, and so I'm going to go ahead and do what I can to improve on what we have. Now, a lot of people ask me, why would you shoot RAW as opposed to JPEG? And there are many answers to that question. But obviously, if this had been a JPEG file, it would have been pretty much a no-go, and I really wouldn't have tried to save it. But as you'll see as we go through the workflow, there's an awful lot we can do with this, and so I'm going to kind of just take you through that and see what we end up with. So the first thing to address, if we look at the sliders here, is to work with the white balance. And on this occasion, I think if we look at daylight, that's a little on the blue side. If we look at cloudy, so it gets a bit warmer. But we can take this little white balance check here, a little eyedropper, and find something to white balance from, and I'm going to pick this little white sign here. That's a big improvement already. In fact, what I'm going to do is probably just warm that up just a little bit more and push that slider over to about there. And these numbers can be somewhat arbitrary, so I would encourage you to just play with the sliders, and you know, there's no right and there's no wrong, and that seems to work for me at 9700. The tint, this kind of I'm just going to knock this down to, let's see, that kind of we'll give it about there. Now the exposure, you can see this is obviously a big problem here. And so I'm going to run this exposure slider and just open that up and just look at the histogram. In fact, let me go ahead and turn on the highlight clipping warning there. You can see we're starting to blow some highlights out here, but I'm going to go ahead and just push that out more until we can work with this area here. This is what I'm kind of concentrating on right now, and that looks pretty good to me, so let me just give it a little bit more. Okay. The next tool along is the recovery slider, and as you'll notice, I'm going from top to bottom. I'm working in an order here, in a sequence. So let's go to the recovery slider. This is an interesting little tool because, as you can see, if we pull that, it actually does indeed recover the highlights. And if you look at the histogram here, you can see I've got a big spike on the right hand side. That's showing me that I've got clipping up in the brightest area. And so I'm going to move that along. You can either put the cursor on this little icon here, or in fact you can just hold your pointer at the top there with an arrow to the left and right, and just move that along until we pull that back, and now we've got detail. Back in here again, you can see over in these red, green and blue values that we've got some data there. Obviously 255 would be completely blown out, and as you can see we're at 250, 247, 246. That's pretty good. And just as a side note there, while we're talking about these red, green and blue values, let's go down to this white sign, and this is where we white balance. And you can see again, if you look at the red, green and blue channel values, we've got 157, 161, 156, and that's fairly neutral. It's got a little bit of a green bias to it. Ideally, on a white surface or a neutral gray surface, those numbers would be all equal. But I'll take this. It's a late afternoon shot, and this works for me. So moving on down, this fill light slider here, well, that kind of controls the, more or less kind of like the mid-tone. It kind of just brightens things up a little bit in the middle. So just give that a little tweak there. And you got to be very careful when you use this tool, because it does tend to lower the contrast somewhat. And to counteract that, we'll take the blacks, and I'm going to just move those and just push the contrast back in just a little bit there. There, that looks kind of good to me. Okay, so working on down, we have a brightness slider here. You can see how this basically brightens and darkens the whole scene. And so I'm just going to give that just a little bit of a tweak there, and I think we'll settle on something about 65 will work nicely. Contrast, well, I don't kind of use the contrast slider too much, but again, it's arbitrary. If you want to give it a little bit of a boost, you can, and we'll just give it just a little tweak. And the vibrance, this is an interesting tool because this kind of saturates colors that are not as saturated as other colors. So it kind of protects the saturation of colors that are deeply saturated, whilst adding some saturation to colors that aren't. And so I kind of just like to push that up just a little. You see what that does? It just gives it a little bit of kind of oomph, a little bit of bite. And saturation slider, I tend not to touch this too much. It's a bit more global, and you can see it kind of really, makes a big impact. But now, just for the sake of argument here, let's give it a little tweak anyway. So there, we're pretty done on that side. And what I like to do here, if we look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see if we click on this, you'll see it brings up a little workflow options screen, and I like to be working in Adobe RGB 1998. This all depends on what the output purpose of the file is going to be. If it's for the web, I would process this in sRGB, which is a smaller color space, but as I'm going to be printing this file, I want to be working in a larger color space, and one of preference for me is Adobe RGB 1998. And here we can change the resolution of the file on the DPI. I'm going to change that to 300 because that's what I work with on printing. And here you can see the size of the file. It's a fairly big file. This was shot on a medium format digital back, and it's 39.3 megapixels. But we can change that. We can cut that down to a smaller usable file, and we'll put this down to something like a 7.1 megapixel. That'll just be a nice little 5x7, 8x10 kind of file size, and we'll click OK there. Okay, so we're all done, and at that point I can either just click here on the done, and it will save the file back to where it came from with adjustments, or I can click on open image, and by default it would then open the image into Photoshop, where I would make any final adjustments that I wanted to make, or that's where I'd go ahead and print the file. So thank you for watching this Wednesday's edition of Workflow Wednesday.